you all to Stories of Women's Identity and Social Control under TMYS Review's December 2021 project in association with Oxford University Press. We are also calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays as part of the project. To know more, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today, we are honored to present among us our very erudite Somrita Ganguly and Shantanu Ray Chaudhuri. Somrita is a professor and award-winning poet and a literary translator. She was a Fulbright doctoral research fellow at Brown University in the USA and is currently the head of the Department of English in Maharaja Manindra Chandra College under the University of Calcutta. She has served as an expert reader for the Penn Translates Translation Grant in the UK, the National Endowment for the Arts Translation Grant in the US, and many more. Somrita's work has been showcased at the London Book Fair, and she has read her works in cities such as Aligarh, Bloomington, Bombay, Boston, Calcutta, Chandigarh, and all over the world. Previously, Somrita taught British literature to undergraduate and graduate students in Delhi and has presented research papers at national and international conferences all over the world. She has 15 academic publications to her credit and is a recipient of the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund Award and the Sarojini Datta Memorial Prize. Next, we have our very favorite Shantanu Ray Chaudhuri, who is a film buff and an editor who has worked with some of India's best-known authors like Gulzar, Kiran Nagarkar, Manu Joseph, among others. He launched the Cinema, Music and Culture List in India publishing for HarperCollins, India, and exclusively built some prominent names in cinema writing. Shantanu has been commissioned and published several books on cinema, which have won the National Award for the Best Book on Cinema and the Mami Award for Best Writing on Cinema, and which have been bestsellers in their times. In 2017, he won the Editor of the Year award, instituted by the apex publishing body Publishing Next. He is also the author of two books, Whims, a book of poems, published in 1998 by Writers' Workshop, and Icons from Bollywood 2005, published by Puffin Books. I welcome both you, Somrita and Mr. Shantanu, and I would now start this very interesting session, taking your opinion on the very topic that we have today among us. And I would first go to Somrita. Somrita, a few words on the topic, please.
Good evening, Megha. Hello, everyone. First of all, delighted to be here. Hi, Shantanu. Very happy to be here today talking about a subject that feels strangely personal and also, simultaneously a little distant, which is why I'm always caught between whether I should speak about it or not. But eventually I give in and I speak because it's necessary to have the conversations. We've lived in silence for too long. What can I say about inter-caste marriages with a special focus on literature? Before we get into that, this is like a gentle reminder for all of us. This is 2021. And if we are still talking about inter-caste marriages, let's begin there. If inter-caste marriages are still a reality, then the caste system is also, unfortunately, a reality. And this is for everyone who thinks reservations in the current context are a sham because the caste structure is a thing of the past. No. I admit that the implementation of the present-day reservation policies leaves a lot to be desired, and some people might be feeling frustrated, but please open your eyes to the everyday lived realities of this nation. I think we also eminently need to keep in mind who is having this conversation and where. Shantanu and I, TMYS, our team over here, Megha, all of us, we already have a lot of social, cultural, and financial capital to be even engaging in this, to be even having this conversation from our air-conditioned bedrooms or offices, sitting in these urban centers. But please think again, how many Tier 1 cities do we have in this country? How many Tier 2 cities do we have in this country? And therefore, how many villages do we have in this country? how much of this country are we sitting in these urban centers entirely unaware of, right? So um, I wanted to begin with that disclaimer, and I think I would go into literature, but why don't we hear from Shantanu a little bit, and then I'll go into some of these texts that I want to talk about.
Definitely, that's a beautiful insight, Somrita.
Yeah,
Mr. Shantanu,
that's
please, some words.
very illuminating for somebody, as you mentioned. I belong to a section of people privileged and sort of who can talk about this aspect of caste, without really being affected by it in any way. I don't. It does not impinge on my everyday life, but you know, I read about it in newspapers. The horrors don't stop coming every morning. Uh, I would like to know Shomrita's and Joy's inputs on how this has been dealt with in literature, because that's something I'd really, particularly, in the past 15, 20 years, what we called as Dalit literature has actually come across. And, like broadening the base from just intercaste marriages to sort of addressing this aspect of caste. Because you see, I'll talk about primarily uh, this aspect as seen through cinema and Hindi cinema, because that's where, I- if I were to talk about it in the context of South cinema from the south of India, I would probably not, there's much more progressive in, within quotes, work done there than in Hindi cinema. And I'm more aware of Hindi cinema, sort of, but I'd like to know your inputs on how literature has, because, and in Hindi cinema, the aspect of caste has been, very, so we'll come into that, has been very, very sort of superficially addressed. You know, primarily the one premise I'll leave in this introductory thing is the fact that caste in cinema isn't as uh, isn't hasn't been portrayed as visually as religion, as probably religion. Like that's also because Hindi cinema has had a very lazy uh, attitude of taking shortcuts. So, when it comes to religion, you give a man a cap and a beard, and you can say, "Ye Muslim ho gaya hai." You give a man, even in this day and age, till recently, a suit and a coat, and ask him to speak men. Kya karta hai men, and it becomes a Christian. And you give a guy a balle balle and a turban, he becomes a Sikh. That kind of lazy writing, lazy depiction is not possible. How do you mark caste? You know, which has, in the south, the reason is because there are certain markers, uh, uh, visible markers. In the north, there is not. If I were to walk past another person, I wouldn't know whether that person. So, and that's been the part of Hindi. The world of Hindi cinema when it comes to caste, and if you look at it, just one point which I think is important. Look at the history of Hindi cinema, taking out the last 10 odd years. Most Hindi cinema characters don't come with a surname. The hero is Vijay or Ajay or Vikram. They don't have Kumar hai, Avasti hai, Chatterjee hai, kya hai, you don't know. The heroine is Shanti, Asha, Lata, or anybody. You don't have a. So, there's a total negation of the caste aspect. You don't know where the man is coming from, the woman is coming from, the social status, the caste status. Nothing is, that's, and the only thing that you can tell from the name is whether is Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Sikh. And even those are very lazily defined, sort of. So I'll leave at that. I'd very much like to know Joy's and Somrita's interaction. And again, before I forget, thank you, Coral, for inspiring me to be on this show today. I have been away for a while because of certain problems, and I didn't want to miss this. I thought this was too interesting to sort of, whatever be the personal reasons, I have been, but I'm glad I'm part of it, and I'm looking forward to both your comments. Thank you, Megha, for coordinating this with us.
It is actually my honor, sir, to have you among us today. And hello, Joy. Very good evening to
Hi,
you.
hi,
Just
hi.
give me a couple of minutes to introduce you very wonderfully. So we have among us Joy Sengupta, who I don't have to mention much. He's a very prominent face all around cinema, both Hindi and Bangla, as well as theatre. He was born in Kolkata, was brought up in Delhi and Nepal, and Joy did his graduation in English literature from Delhi University. And during this period, he joined the Jananatya Manch, a theatre group based in Delhi, and went on to receive a diploma in drama from the Living Theatre Academy, and where he studied under Mr. Ibrahim Arkazi. Apart from this wonderful debut in Hazar Chaurasi Ki Maa in 1998, Joy has given us some wonderful performances in both popular and independent cinema. His prominent performances can be traced in films like Vidar Bomkesh in 2018, Teen Kahon in 2014, Jara Brishtite Vijay Chilo in 2007, Bhopal, A Prayer for Rain in 2014, among many more. Joy's contribution to the Indian theatre stands unparalleled with his excellent roles in globally acclaimed plays like A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen, Dance Like a Man by Mahesh Datani, Dinner with Friends by Donald Margulies, and Shireen Shah. And I invite you, Joy, today among us. And I would like a few words from you on the topic we are discussing today, that is intercaste marriages in art forms.
You see, thank you so much for having me here. It's this topic. I thought we all thought, or probably the previous generation of progressives also thought, would remain a limited topic, but as it has happened, that it has become a timeless topic. The dogma of caste, the conflict of caste, the contradictions of caste in our society just goes on and on and on. And the various tragedies which spirals out of this contradiction also goes on and on and on. And what we are trying to understand is how does different mediums of expression reflect, absorb, and communicate this matter. Contextually, how does it place it? How is caste placed in context of cinema and literature in Indian society? Now, as was earlier mentioned, the topic on Indian cinema or Hindi cinema, as we know as so-called national cinema, and that is the mainstream Hindi cinema, because Hindi language cinema also has different streams. There is parallel stream, there is the serious stream, there is the independent stream, which has very vocalized independent voices, not always placed in the mainstream and therefore not accessible to all and sundry. But Hindi mainstream cinema becomes the national cinema, becomes a sort of a quasi voice of Indian popular expression all over the world, not just in India. And there, sadly, but understandably, caste has played a role marginally and mostly in the back of the audience. The reason for that is, for the longest amount of time, the Hindi mainstream cinema was cultureless and rootless. What I mean by that is, regional cinema is rooted in specific cultural context and subcultural context, whether it is cinema from Kerala, cinema from Karnataka, cinema from Andhra Pradesh, cinema from Bengal, Assam, wherever, you will find context. You will find various subcultural plots coming into regional cinema. But Hindi cinema, because it calls itself the national cinema, it doesn't know where to place itself contextually. It doesn't know whether it should be giving the mainstream audience a world which is created and showcased as a Hindi cinema world, or should it be contextually placed in some region in India where it becomes defined and recognizable by only certain section of people in India. So this dilemma pushed Hindi mainstream cinema, I keep on saying mainstream cinema, for the longest period of time into creating a world of itself. So a Hindi cinema world was a different world. It was India, yes, there were many cultural connotations which crept in, but it was a world by itself. Its music, which was borrowed from folk music, mostly from the north. Of course, when people like S.D. Burman came, they also borrowed from East and all. But Again, it became what we call filmy music. It had a word and rhythm and a context of its own, independent of any cultural specificity. And that is the reason that when a Hindi cinema character is introduced, you generally, for the longest amount of time, till 80s, I would say, didn't know which region he or she was from. They were generic names. A servant was always Ramu Kaka. Yes, once in a while, Ramu Kaka did introduce a little Bhojpuri in his introduce a little bit of that, because Bombay being the place of Hindi cinema, it had a whole lot of people coming from what you call UP and Bihar, and who were doing the manual labor in Bombay. So this manual labor concept got absorbed in Hindi cinema, as those who do manual labor become Ramu Kaka. So they became Ramu Kaka over there. The hero was, of course, the names kept changing, but in the 70s when I was growing up, there was Amit, there was Vijay, and so on and so forth. There was Prem in the 80s and 90s, but they were just that. And there was a certain design behind it. The Hindi cinema maker were very smart people. They had thought this. They came from the beginning of Hindi cinema actually began with a certain Nehruvian idiom of nation building. So they were inspired, the film industry of 50s was inspired by this concept of nation building, which was supposed to be beyond caste and creed and gender and religion. So they wanted to be neutral, caste neutral and religious neutral. So never will you see a Hindi film villain for the longest amount of time, again till about 70s, specifying a religion. Now you see Hindi cinema, the propagandist cinema, being dominated by so-called villains who come from Muslim background. But then you didn't. You had a Daga, you had a DK, you had an RK, you had these sort of acronyms, but you never knew whether the person was Christian or Muslim or whatever. He may be wearing a suit.
Loin, for example, Loin and all the smugglers.
Correct. So he might have a henchman who will be called Peter.
Yeah.
But the main villain will be called Daga, JK Saab, and all that. Similarly, a hero in the city may be called Vijay, but when he is in his village, there will be a Babu attached to it. He is Shekhar Babu, Mohan Babu aa gaye hain, Shekhar Babu aa gaye hain. There is a certain different kind of decorum which is attached to it, but never caste and never religion. That was a conscious choice that the Hindi cinema world made. And mind you, again I say, the mainstream Hindi cinema in the 40s, 50s and 60s were held by very progressive people. Whether the writing came from the progressive background. The K. Abbasis of this world wrote the script. The Sahil Ludhanvis of this world wrote the lyrics and the poetry. And the Sora Modi and Gurudat and Raj Kapoor of the world directed the film. But they too kept the name casteless and religionless, because they actually believed in all their naivete and, if I may say, their leftist idealism, that what we are tackling in society is class conflict and not caste conflict. This was the confusion, you may say, I would say ignorance. They constantly, Hindi cinema constantly reflected on class conflict, whether it's the agrarian caste conflict or whether it is the industrial class conflict. That is why the rich-poor dichotomy in Hindi cinema existed. Rich boy, poor girl, poor boy, rich girl, whatever. So often the hero would be this poor working class boy, and the heroine would be a capitalist, this thing. And she has to be tamed by this working class boy. So because she is extremely unruly and arrogant and all, and she'll be tamed. In the end, class would also get deflated when these two come together. So class conflict became the primary focus of Hindi cinema, and the reason being is, for the longest amount of time, the left forces in India who governed the intellectual space in India did not give enough importance to caste. If you talk to any Bahujan Samaj activist or this thing, intellectual, they will openly say that the Marxists, the leftists, they never gave importance to caste, and that is why we reject them. And that is why many a Bahujan, many a Dalit intellectual who were part of the leftist fold, they left that and started an independent chart or voice or whatever you call it, whether it's Namdev Dhatal or whoever you call it. Because I stay in Maharashtra and I know the Dalit movement in Maharashtra is very, very strong. Dalit tribal movement in Maharashtra is really, really strong. The working class movement is actually a Dalit movement in Maharashtra. And they reject the leftist and the Marxist position there because it didn't get reflected. And you know the Hindi cinema was for the longest amount of time governed by leftist ideals. You know, that's why you had literally leftist films like you call them Mazdoor and Do Biga Zameen and etc. 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 And that's why caste comes only marginally. It did come, if you remember, right in the 1930s in Achut Kanya. Of course, it came in sentimental doses. It came in ornamental package. It came in a certain kind of innocence and feel-good factor. But it did come in Achut Kanya. It did come through Bimol Roy in Sujata. Of course, again, it came through Brahminical idealism of the hero and the desperation of the heroine. So, you know, you can say the prism of looking at it was different. It was being seen through Mr. Roy's lens, who was a Brahmin or whatever. But it did come in Sujata. And then one had to take a huge jump to come to the 21st century, where you started seeing films where characters are defined by their surname. They were no more deprived of the surname. If you see Lagan has a plethora of characters. Lagan tried to create a microcosm of Indian society, because in that particular team of Lagan, there is a representation of every caste and class and clan, right from a Sikh to a Chamar to a Mahar to everything. They were there in Lagan. Again, I am saying it was a very well packaged, sort of a dreamy sort of a vehicle, but it was there. And now you jump to Article 15, where caste is being confronted directly, where a Brahmin police officer is saying he is ignorant about caste because his university education also did not empower his thoughts about caste. It's only when it comes to the village to deal with his police horizon and zone that he encounters that everything is class regime. It is a day-to-day aspect. And if you ask me, I realized it too late, because when I was growing up, I never understood the question of caste myself, because that was never an education that I got either in school or in college or at home. My parents, being upper caste Brahminical parents, had friends who were all from the similar caste character. So our interaction was always, my Sengupta's interaction was with the Dasgupta or Mukherjee or Bhattacharya or whatever you call it, or in North, Tripathi, Tiwari, whatever, because that was around my household, right? So if my parents didn't interact with other castes, I could not interact. So I grew up like that. So I grew up caste neutral without any understanding and knowledge. Similar with religion, we hardly had any Muslim friends within the family fold. It is later on when I confronted my family and my extended family, when they kept on saying, we don't believe in caste. And I said, how can you believe in caste when you don't have a single friend or association or any kind of interaction with people of other castes? So how can you even call and say that I don't believe in caste? To believe in something, to believe in such a noble value of not believing in caste, you first have to interact, you first have to engage, and then understand, and then speak about what you reject and what you don't reject. You are not part of it, and so your rejection holds no value. This I understood much later when I started, in a post-college, and I entered that spectrum of progressive, nuanced thinking and understanding of my surroundings. I started questioning everything around me. And that's when I became conscious that, oh my God, my cinema is also not questioning everything. But I'm glad that certain aspects of it is changing now.
That was actually a very wonderful and very enriching insight, Joy. And I have watched cinema since I was like of sense. And then these are certain issues which I have always felt. But hearing it from you verbally actually makes a lot of sense. So, okay, I'll not go further, and I'll ask some questions that are directed to the three of you individually. So I'll start with Somrita. Somrita, I was going through some of your works, and most of your works are like brilliant. All of them are brilliant, and most of them are translated works. So my question kind of surrounds this area of translation. Like, suppose you are going through a very sensitive issue like marriage, more like intercaste marriage, in a language. Suppose you're translating a book from Bengali to English, and suppose you're going through this system in the Bengali culture, written in Bengali language. So while translating it into English, which is kind of not only a foreign language but a foreign culture altogether. So did you feel any sort of void that you had to kind of fill culturally, not just linguistically? And can you give us certain examples of those instances?
Yeah, thanks, Megha. Thanks for that question, but also thanks to Joy for contextualizing a lot of this thing, a lot of contextualizing this conversation. As I was saying, we have to be aware of who we are, where we're sitting, where our conversation is coming from. So if we don't see caste around us, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It only means my vision is so myopic that I cannot look beyond my little circle. Coming to the question of translation, I'm going to take a minute over here to tell you what my translation philosophy is, and maybe that will help us understand this problem a little better. I don't see it as a problem as such, though. When I translate, there are two ways in which you can translate. One is where you make the text very, very readable, very, very accessible to your Western reader. So, instead of, let's say, writing idli, you almost go on to give the recipe of what an idli is, because you imagine that the Western reader will stumble on the word idli. You will translate baba because you imagine the Western reader will not understand what baba is. That is one way of doing it. I don't. I personally think, slow reading is not as bad as the reputation it seems to have gathered over time. I think a little bit of indigestion is okay. So I leave in some of these references in the text without overglossing them, without including things in parentheses, without including footnotes, because I personally think that hinders the fluidity of the reading experience. Because I'm a literary translator, I'm mostly translating fiction or non-fiction, not creative non-fiction. And there is something to be said about the fluidity of that piece which you're reading. And I really think overglossing it, it's like an impediment to the reading process. So I don't do that. I don't italicize my words. And I also personally believe that every translation is an approximation. It is never equal to the text in the source language. It is only equivalent. So as a translator, I'm looking for equivalences, not equalities. Because, let's be honest, no two language systems and no two cultures are equal. If they were, we wouldn't have these different cultures and language systems, right? We would be living in the Tower of Babel. Our tongues would have been the same. We would have spoken the same language. So why did I go into this? This is to tell you that even when I'm translating caste, I leave in references. I trust my readers to be interested enough in finding out about the culture that they are entering into. I am not going to translate every word. For instance, I have seen people who use the word Dalit and then go on to explain what Dalit is in the translation. I will not. If you're interested in finding out who a Dalit person is, if you're interested in the story of this disenfranchised character, one Google search is more than enough to tell you what Dalit identity means today. Will you get all of it? Probably not. Will you understand what I'm saying? For sure. So I respect my reader. I trust them to do this for themselves. And which is why, I'm not averse to the idea of slow reading. Aside from the translation, when I'm talking to classes at Brown or UPenn, it is reductive, but I try to draw parallels between race in America and the caste structure in India. And I am fully conscious of the fact that they are different and reductive, but it also helps my audience understand a little bit the ethics of where I'm coming from. It helps them comprehend what I mean when I'm talking about disenfranchisement in the Indian caste structure. So that is a system which I have tried. People seem to understand. People understand the concept of positive discrimination or repatriation, right, which we have in US universities, US workplaces at this point in time. That's how I enter into the concept of reservation in India, because there are similarities. They understand what positive discrimination means. So they understand what reservation means, the ethics, the ideology behind it, even if they don't understand that 49.5% is divided into 7.5, 15%, 27%, etc. Right? So that's how I like to approach it. That is as far as your specific question on translation is concerned. But just to sort of quickly go back to something that Shantanu had mentioned at the beginning, we do have a lot of Dalit narratives at this point in time. Thankfully, the voices are there. Some of them are writing in English. Some of them are writing in languages that they are more comfortable in, Bangla, Hindi, Marathi, etc. And there are translators who are doing the work, the important work of carrying this story to a global platform. But very, very interestingly, there is not enough conversation on inter-caste marriages, on inter-caste relationships. And, this is something which I thought I would, a couple of questions which I thought I would, have us mull over towards the end of the conversation, but maybe we can think about it right now, all of us, even our audience that has joined us for this live stream. Why do we not have more narratives on inter-caste marriages in India? And why are these narratives always so sad? Of course, you'll have, a text like, let's say, Chetan Bhagat's Two States, the story of my marriage. That's an exception to the rule. That is not the literature we read every day. That is niche. That is talking about a couple that have social, cultural, financial capital. That is talking about a couple from two urban centers. That is talking about a couple that has been able to have access to education. What is happening, as I said, in the rest of the country? Right? I mean, Shantanu is going to talk more about this, I'm sure. One of my favorite movies in recent times, I've watched it and rewatched it so many times, is Masan. And it's fantastic because, it's showing us this picture of India where some of these boundaries are collapsing, right? Where historically opposed castes, Brahmins, Baniyas, Dalits, they now have a space where they can gather together.
It's very interesting you bring this up. And just to interject with one,
yes.
The thing about Masan is that, if you look at, the film begins with a Brahmin girl in a relationship in a clandestine setting with a Baniya.
Yeah.
And it's the Brahmin who is being subject to the kind of humiliations she is subject to, the police officer is now actually, it's probably a sign of the changing times that a Brahmin woman is being subject to this kind of humiliation and blackmailing by a police officer, by a man in law enforcement. And the film ends with the sort of understated coming together of this dome and this woman girl, and they are traveling to Sangam, which is sort of which says
absolutely.
a lot.
Absolutely.
There is there's an absence of the caste narrative in Hindi cinema, and that's why I'm not aware of why there's this absence of marriages in literature that you mentioned, that inter-caste marriages in Hindi cinema, it's absent because caste is absent. So if caste is absent, inter-caste marriages can't sort of
Bilkul. Absolutely.
This is one of the films which addresses that relationship between castes, where the Brahmin is at the receiving end, the Baniya commits suicide. It's the dome who's actually gets ahead in life, becomes the first man in the family in his family to sort of
Yeah.
get a coveted job, a job in the Indian Railways. Sort of,
Yeah.
it comes together that he gets a job in the railways when the railways were the first institution to sort of bring about a break in this caste system when it first started. For the first time, people of different castes had to perforce sit together without,
Yeah.
like with different castes had to sit together. So it's a statement on that also as a part of. So please
Yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead. I
yeah.
wanted to
No,
take that.
absolutely. No, so much nuance. I mean, I'm so glad you brought in uh, this aspect as well. I was thinking about it from a similar yet slightly dissimilar context, where if you see how Deepak and Shalu meet, Deepak at that point in time is a civil engineering student in a university. What does this tell us? If Deepak were primarily a dome and not just a dome helping out his dad by night, would he have had access to Shalu?
Yeah.
What does this tell us about these spaces that are being created in the country, these pockets, which are very, very democratic, of course, right? The university, the social media space, trains, airplanes, where, there is a possibility of this meeting and this, this sort of coming together. But what about people that do not have access to these little pockets of democracy? Because these are very tiny pockets. How many Deepaks are being able to, rise above their caste, have access to university education, and then meet somebody like Shalu? Right. Also, very interesting thing for me in this film is that this girl dies. It's almost as if fate or cosmos or universe or whatever you want to call it is coming in to intervene so that they don't have to make that eventual decision. In real life, would a Deepak and Shalu have been able to live together?
Yeah.
A dome and this upper class Bania girl. Fate almost seems to come in and intervene and say, Man kasturi re, jag
Obviously,
dasturi re, baat hui na puri re.
if you look at the spate of honor killings that we
Yeah.
still have,
Yeah. Yeah.
people being killed just because
Yeah.
their voters match. They haven't, there's no, but it's just so obviously there's something that is a very fact of life. This problem with inter-caste marriages.
No, absolutely. Which is also, I think, one of the reasons why there is not much of it in our literatures. I'm thinking at this point in time, I'll also link it to something that both Joy and Shantanu said about, the absence of caste from cinema. It almost comes from the fact that there is an assumption that if you're from a particular caste, you have to behave and you have to act in a particular way. You so often hear your friend ask another friend, oh, you don't look like someone from the scheduled caste. How is someone from the scheduled caste supposed to look like? Please tell me. अरे गाड़ी खरीद ली है, मोबाइल कितने की ली, जैकेट महंगा लग रहा है. A farmer in Punjab might have more money than a teacher in West Bengal. It's not about the money, right? Very often in our country, we seem to, and obviously there are points of union between class and caste conflicts, but we seem to, collate the two and reduce the two struggles. It's not only a struggle of upward class mobility. It's a struggle for equal opportunity. More importantly, it's a struggle for dignity. We often hear the phrase, Gori Brahman, a poor Brahmin. And that's not a very offensive phrase to us. But then sometimes we hear the phrase, a rich Dalit. Why is that offensive? Arey, because he's rich despite being a Dalit. On the other hand, oh, he's Gorib in spite of being a Brahmin. It is about that surname. It is about that stigma. When was the last time that we had the caste census in India? Why is it not being conducted? So, obviously there is a lot of conversation on caste, as it should happen in the present times. I don't find much of it in terms of specifically intercaste relationships. Maybe because there aren't very many. Maybe because we're only people like us, we're sitting in universities and, you know, these little wells that have become our worlds, and we are not looking beyond.
In Hindi cinema, particularly in mainstream cinema, it's also because I read a comment somewhere and I noted this down. Varun Grover, somebody as enlightened as Varun
Yeah.
Grover, could come up with this. He actually mentioned that Hindi films generally shy away from caste issues because the makers are primarily Savarna Hindus, and they're privileged and find it convenient to ignore that they have been party to the deeply problematic issue of caste. So that, and you see, this problem manifests in a very recent film. I don't know how many of us have seen Dhadak. There is this original film that was made in Marathi called Sairat. So it's one of
Oh,
those
yeah, yeah.
it's one of those cult films now, like that talks about caste in a way that very few Indian films have. And when that film is made by somebody who has the means to break the narrative, Karan Johar is producing Dhadak, and the basis of Sairat is this caste issue, and the Hindi film simply does away with the caste angle. It becomes a rich boy, poor girl sort of same caste thing. So they're just ignoring that whole aspect. And this is a film that was the originals made in 2016. The Hindi remake comes in 2018. This is just three,
Yeah,
4 years
yeah,
back. We are not still comfortable with
yeah.
discussing caste, or even look at
No.
Manikarnika for that. Another, we are talking about national issues and the
Mm.
freedom fighter. I was reading, like in the course of this, my reading for this, you know, a very important character in Manikarnika is this in Rani Jhansi's story is this Dalit freedom fighter called Jhalkari Bai Kori,
Yeah.
and and the film actually gives her just a couple of minutes and another 3 minutes for an item song. That is the level, and this is supposed to be a film on a freedom fighter, and the actor playing, like, even I wasn't aware of, that's the level of ignorance that we have about caste and caste issues in India. Yes, as Joy pointed out, very pertinent, that in the 30s and 40s and 50s we had a very, very uh, uh, progressive looking bunch of filmmakers, the K. Abbases, the Raj Kapoors, the Bimal Roys. So, and that's why, an Achut Kanya or a Sujata address the issue, but they address the issue from a very paternalistic point. It's almost like uh, uh, the, the filmmaker is, it's very Gandhian. Like Gandhi used the word Harijan, and which became very problematic. Sujata, in fact, has a beautiful scene which is totally alien to the kind of issues that the kind of depictions that are beginning now. For example, Sujata wants to study like her sister. You know, she's not allowed to do that because the family is sort of. So she picks up the Ramayana and says, "Ye kitab meri kitab hai." Now that, for that time, is very, very sort of, I don't think any Dalit or any, would sort of own up to the Ramayana as being a text that he or she would say is my text. So that was the sort of paternalistic Gandhian thing of, okay, let's uh, imbibe all of them and, be take, and that was part of, okay, let, like tolerance, like the phrase tolerance has become sort of, like, so
Yeah.
acceptance, let's accept the Muslims into our fold, let's accept the Dalits into our fold. That has been the thing. It's only now, like, uh, even for that matter, uh, offbeat parallel cinema depictions like Damul uh, or Ankur, for that matter, Sham Benegal's Ankur, had depictions of, and they were reflective of the times, I guess. Like, they had depictions of the Dalit as this sort of powerless, alcoholic, like if you look at the character in Ankur, you know, almost comical sort of, totally ineffectual character. Now I think that even that is problematic, and that's because the makers, Masan is being directed by somebody who owns up to his
Yeah.
uh, caste status, or Kala, for the Tamil film Kala, which had Rajnikant portray, like I don't see any mainstream superstar of that stature portraying a Dalit character or a lower caste sort of character in mainstream Hindi cinema. Ranjit, the director of that of Kala, is belongs to that strata. They are, or uh, even the director of Sairat, Manjule, Nagraj Manjule, they are they believe in the Ambedkarite sort of thing, and they are placing their films unapologetically in that space, which was never the case with cinema. And so relationships were never exist. When caste did not exist, relationships could not exist. With caste now becoming a part of the narrative with films like Sairat and Masan, you see the relationships coming in. You see the
Yeah.
relationship conflict in Sairat. You see that in Masan, which is sort of takes into its ambit all the castes that we are talking of here. So that's what
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah. You're actually reminding me of this work by Arundhati Roy, The God of Small Things. It doesn't end in marriage. It ends in something much more powerful than marriage. But this relationship between Ammu and Velutha. One of these, why is Velutha such a problematic character for the people in Kerala? Right? Because he is a worker in a pickle factory that Ammu's father owns. And he transgresses his class and his caste in his audacity to choose someone like Ammu. He's transgressing so many things. Simultaneously, if you look at Ammu, she doesn't want to subscribe to the gender roles that have been prescribed for her by her society. So she's transgressing, and together they are transgressing what Arundhati Roy calls love laws, right? What are love laws? They are laws that tell you who to love, how to love, and how much to love. Anything more than that is jihad. Anything more than that is a crime. And you pay a price for the crime. Right? Velutha dies in prison, custodial death. He's tortured to death. Ammu, when she dies, she's locked up in a room. She's not allowed to see her children. She's lost. She's lonely. Even in death, she's denied dignity, right? Because her body is wrapped up in this sort of dirty bed sheet. She's sent to a crematorium because the church has refused to bury her, and she's buried. She's cremated with other beggars and abandoned people. For me, one of the most interesting sort of scenes in this, one of the most interesting places in this novel is where Ammu's aunt, baby Kochamma, asks her, but how can you choose to be with someone like him? Doesn't he smell? So that sense again, that a Dalit person is supposed to smell offensive. He's supposed to look a certain way. He's supposed to behave a certain way. And that is why Velutha is so interesting, because, he almost looks arrogant. He walks with his head held high. He's offering suggestions to people. He doesn't take, he doesn't, he's not subservient. He doesn't take too kindly to authority. And then they're paying a price for it. So that is my question. Where are the narratives about people that are not having to pay the price? And if we don't have these narratives, is it deeply reflective of the symptoms of disease that our society is still going through? That an inter-caste marriage, an inter-caste relationship will not have a happy ending if you're not in your xylos, if you're not sitting in your urban center. Even there are problems. Right?
That's extremely like I'm kind of moved today with both of your inputs, and I don't know what I was expecting from this answer, but I'm like really in a kind of a shock right now. And as you put, like talked about the entire intervention of fate and divinity in Masan, it kind of reminded me of the Greek concept of Deus ex machina. That's the intervention of the fate and divine, and it's extremely interesting in how you ended it with Arundhati Roy. So I'll not waste more time. I'll go to Joy this time, and I would ask you a little
We
bit
are
about
very
theatre.
disobedient students, Megha, as you might have realized. The question was something else. But this is in our nature. 60
That's
मार्क्स का
Absolutely
क्वेश्चन
love
था,
the
हमें
disobedience.
जो आता था हम बोल दिए, अब मार्क्स आपके हाथ में है.
that's the way of the way the cookie crumbles in conversations like this. You are always
Definitely.
uh,
In a flux.
Yeah, it's a gathering of passionate people, and there is no point I'm stopping any of you. So, okay, my next question is to Joy, and it's kind of specific to theater, but you can talk about cinema and theater. So, I've watched your works, amazing works, and since you have worked in theater in certain plays by Henrik Ibsen and Mahesh Dattani, and both of these plays kind of deal with marriage, the sensitive issues of marriage, though we don't really get to see much of an intercaste system going on here. But how would you say that these are conducted in a theatrical performance, which is more live and we don't really have scope for editing and stuff? And how is a Western concept different from a more native Indian concept?
I actually did a play which was the central plot was an intercaste marriage, and it was one of the most disturbing plays that I've ever done. In the sense that the playwright, the great Vijay Tendulkar, late Vijay Tendulkar, actually brought in a nuance and perspective which was growing in the Maharashtrian society post the Dalit Panthers movement. In Maharashtra, post Dalit Panthers movement, there was a certain militant mode creeping into the Dalit movement in Maharashtra. It was no more the Jyotiba Phule influence. It was no more just Ambedkarite. It was directly influenced by the Black Panthers movement, and they were becoming very militant. And they were feeling empowered. And there were certain mainstream parties, including Shiv Sena, who were accepting and adopting that militant mode from the Dalit Panthers movement. So a certain degree of, what should I say, lumpenism was creeping in the fringes of that movement. Not in the center. The center may be ideologically driven, but in the fringes, the lumpenism was creeping in. And Vijay Tendulkar wrote a play called Kanyadan, which was around it. It was very disturbing because it reverses the victimization dynamic. Vijay Tendulkar, who had written Ghasiram Kotwal, which is one of the greatest classics of Indian theatre, was actually a direct attack, frontal attack on the Puneri Brahmanical domination, on the Peshwa, right? This Kotwal takes on the Peshwa. And Peshwas, as you know, traditionally dominated all other castes in Maharashtra, including the Marathas, and Shivaji was a Maratha and a backward caste king, and so always undermined and dominated and humiliated by the Peshwas. And Vijay Tendulkar actually wrote this play, which was attacked by Shiv Sena many times. The Pune Brahmins boycotted it, so he faced a lot of these things. And when he wrote Kanyadan, he actually was attacked by the Dalits because he had raised a very difficult question about victim and victimization. Because in this play, what happens is the character that I played, yes, being a Brahmin, I played a Dalit character, Athavle, who comes from the Mahar background, from a very, very depressed and deprived background, full of historical anger and complexity. I say historical anger. It's not just anger of today, but anger of last 2,500 years. All stuck within him, embittered. He gets to the university level because of the changing scenario that was happening in the social movement that was happening in Maharashtra and elsewhere. He gets to the university, he does well over there, he becomes a celebrated poet. not just in the Dalit circle, but in the literary circle of Maharashtra, in the emerging literary circle of Maharashtra, Pune, Nagpur, and so on and so forth. He also becomes the founder of one of the Dalit, subversive Dalit movement, political movement, on the outer ring of the broader socialist movement that was there in Maharashtra. So if the broader socialist movement is run by a Dandavate or a Deshpande, this was on the outer ring of it was the Dalit movement. So he becomes embody of all that, and he becomes a kind of a hero or a role model, even for a Gandhian-minded person. So we have the heroine of this play, whose father is a Gandhian socialist. He's a Brahmin, but a socialist and a Gandhian, and dedicated to eradicating caste from society. So all noble ideals they had. The whole family was dedicated to eradicating caste. And the father was always in favor of inter-caste mingling, marriages, and communion. Because that was the Gandhian way, that you eliminate by this pacifist sort of coming together and not the militant conflict. This girl literally falls in love with Athavle. Now, whether she falls in love with him or the idea of this rebel, poet, subversive personality, and that whole idea that her father had put in her head, she probably falls in love with the idea. But she falls in love with Athavle. And for Athavle, this girl represents something way out of his league in a way, and therefore very attractive. So while the father is overwhelmed and happy about this communion and encourages this, because he feels this is the step that we have to take. We have to encourage within our family and space inter-caste marriages in order to eradicate caste. The mother, being the practical one, says we also have to take into account the culture and other stuff, because the two culture is very different, and this boy may not be able to fit into this particular household, a Brahminical, Puneri Brahminical household. The mother and the father are in conflict, they are in disagreement. The daughter follows the father and gets married to the boy. And then she starts experiencing sudden bouts of violence from Athavle, which she had not imagined. Now, what happens to Athavle? Now, this was taken from a real incident. I'll come to that later. But what happened to Athavle was, whenever he used to drink, and he said this, it's a historical thing. My father drank and beat up my mother, so I drink. And it's nothing new for me. I've seen this while I was growing up. And whenever he drank and became blinded by rage, he didn't see his wife, he saw a Brahmin in front of him. So he saw a caste enemy, a historical caste enemy in front of him. So he used to lose his sense. So whenever he became violent, he was not becoming violent with this girl, this vulnerable, well-meaning, progressive girl, whom he loved. He loved her dearly. But for him, she was also the representation of all the caste violence which his family and his forefathers had experienced. So he would unabashedly, unashamedly be violent to her. And then when he comes to senses, he would apologize all the time. And keep saying things like, hit me, I'm a Mahar, I'm nothing, I'm nowhere, I've been in this, my forefathers have carried, your goo all around, and that's what we are, and that's how I am. You knew when you married me what kind of person I am. So Tendulkar actually reverses the whole thing. And this person, when he becomes a celebrated poet, he actually undermines and dominates his father-in-law, who is a well-known intellectual, a Gandhian intellectual. Dominates and undermines his authority and tries to rise above it, but not just through intellect, but through a certain lumpen behavior. Now, Tendulkar was pillaged because of this play. He got a Sahitya award for it, but they all said it's an anti-Dalit play, whereas Tendulkar kept saying, I have not written an anti-Dalit play. Tendulkar saw this incident which has happened very close by. I don't want to take names because it becomes controversial, but one of the leaders of Dalit Panthers Party had got married to a Brahminical girl, and certain some such incidents had happened. Tendulkar's own daughter had, Tendulkar's best friend's daughter had got married to out of the caste, and some issues had happened, which was similar in nature. And he took that, and he actually made a play about victim and victimization, that today's victim can become tomorrow's victimizer. It is possible. Today the Jews are being victimized, tomorrow they might victimize Palestine. Dalits. So that was his theory, which he played on, and he got brickbats. I also got brickbat for doing the play, but it was a very disturbing play. It raised certain questions, and when you become empowered. And when I went to UP and Bihar, and I met the others way back when I used to take workshops for literacy mission. I used to encounter them, and they were really oppressed and suppressed and didn't have a voice. And later on, when they got Yadav's chief minister, and Yadav started getting voice and getting spine and getting a certain footing in society, suddenly they became very, very dominant. And there were incidents where there were section of Brahmins who were scared of the others in certain pockets of UP. So that reversal happened. And Tendulkar was trying to catch this in 1982, during the time of the Dalit Panther movement, as I said. So this is a play which specifically is about an inter-caste marriage. And in the end, Jyoti, the girl, converts to, she says, I am a Dalit now. That's the last speech. She says, I'm no more a Brahmin. She tells her father never to get in touch with her. She says, I don't like Brahmins and I don't want Brahmins to come into my household. The violence that I experience are the violence which Dalits have experienced for ages. So it is nothing new for them, so it's nothing new for me. I will go through this fire and I'll come out as a Dalit. And I don't want you, the Brahminical father, to come near me. So this is a particular play which I've done, so I wanted to share it because it's a direct experience of me going through the dilemma.
Just a question to Joy, Somrita.
Yeah.
Like, since you have this understanding of the literature, is this question, this caste question, has it been addressed in literature or cinema in Bengal? We talk about Marathi and films in the South, Tamil films which have addressed this, but is there literature around this in Bengal also? Is cinema has or is the social structure not as oppressive in Bengal?
It is oppressive. I'll tell you why. I'm ashamed to say it. That we have terms like Bostir Mein very frequently used. Every Bengali household employs women who come from the slums. Most of the slums are about people who are refugees from villages and all. And many of them are subcaste, lower caste, and depressed caste. And they come to work. And they are called Bostir Mein. So if an upper caste girl behaves in a certain way or raises her voice, the mother says, don't behave like Bostir Mein. It is a casteist slur in a way. So it is very much there in Bengal. The word scheduled caste is used very often. I have heard within my extended family discussing caste like he is Das. Das is where does Das feature in the caste pantheon like that. Very good friend is Pal. He's a jeweler. Pal means this in the casteist pantheon. They are aware of the whole pantheon and the whole caste umbrella and they're free of it. And they're ready. They're constantly placing people accordingly. Das, Pal, this, that, all that stuff. And so if an MP or an MLA or anybody is from that particular caste who in their ancestral village were dominated by, say, our caste. Now today he's upwardly mobile or whatever. That is not looked at with great comfort. It is like, okay, today you are flying, huh? Yesterday you used to be whatever position you were. So that is the reality in Bengal. I consider Bengal a very, very casteist society in a certain way, which is covered by this veneer of Bhadralok culture. That Bhadralok culture is actually a Brahminical culture. All our celebrations were actually Brahminical practice of celebration, where we have started allowing them to sometimes come. I've heard in Durga Puja pandals, people looking at certain crowd coming and say, pujas are becoming and being engulfed by very bad crowds. When they say bad crowds, they mean these people who are not supposed to come to our pandal, our puja, and our kind of genteel kind of environment. They don't belong there. They're the mass, they're the crowd, they're the others. And so we have way of, Bengalis have a way of putting nice, Bhadralok, Brahminical, intellectual veneer to all that. It's our Sharat Chandra and our Rabindranath and our all upper caste sort of great artists, authors and this thing. With that, we play up that heritage and we try to take away the caste question. This election, sorry to be political, this election was the first time when caste in Bengal was discussed openly in political platform. Before that, caste was never discussed in political platform. This is the first time when social engineering was applied by all the parties, because great dichotomy had happened in Bengal. In an area called Jungle Mahal, which is dominated by Maoists, was completely taken over by RSS. So RSS, with their Hindutva, had penetrated the tribal areas and placed their pantheon of gods on top of the Dalit god and said, your god is another version of Ram Lalla. And so the depressed caste, lower caste felt dignified and honored to be part of to be allowed into the pantheon of the greater caste by them. So, so that sort of social engineering, mergering has happened. And so how to upset that? So caste equation actually came into this Bengal election, which was never there before. So yeah, Bengal has always been iffy but with the caste issue.
Yeah, no, I completely concur with what Joyce said. This Bhadralo culture can be very, very toxic. And it is really sort of just that veneer which covers up a lot of what is going on. But even historically, we have had a big, important Namoshudro movement in Bengal.
Yes. Yeah.
Horichand Thakur, Guruchand Thakur, who were the Namoshudro leaders, the Mutuar religion, the Mutuar philosophy. Yeah,
completely.
They are breaking away from this sort of, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And because you mentioned East Bengal, this really interesting narrative. There's something I read. I was translating this work by a Dalit writer, Manohar Mouli Bishwash. And he talks about this in this book where he talks about the partition of Bengal. And he says when Gandhi realizes that this is a large community, the Namoshudra community in Bengal, and we're going to need their support, we're going to need their help. Guruchand Thakur actually sent word back through Chittaranjan Das and said, we are not a part of this call for Swaraj. Yeah. They actually supported the partition because they thought, what am I getting in here in Bengal? Yeah. Partition hole hoyto, I will probably have better access to law. I will probably have access to education. I work in this college now, Maharaja Mahendra Chandra College. It's very different from what I'm going to say, but just even somebody like Sir Maharaja Mahendra Chandra Nondi, a Renaissance man in Bengal, they believed in they sort of extended their, embrace to the Namoshudra community, but it was never an embrace which accepted them wholly. Because their opinion was, khub beshi porashono kore fele, if you get too educated, who's going to clean my house? Where is my servant community going to come from? Where am I going to get my domestic laborers from? Yeah. So historically, it has always been there. Right now, because I understand a lot of people say in Bengal, caste works differently. That has something.
This morning, I was reading this article by somebody mentioning Binoy Mazumdar, the poet, the poet sort of, who was targeted for his caste affiliation. If I'm not mistaken, if I remember the article correctly, he belonged to the Namoshudro caste and was targeted majorly by the entrenched literati at that time for his caste. So but I haven't come across, unlike literature in Marathi or in the South, I haven't come across as literature in Bengal that addresses this.
That is because in the South you had the Dravidian movement.
Yeah.
You see, if Periyar hasn't happened in South, then this sudden emergence of this honorable voice of Dalit wouldn't have happened. It's the all-encompassing Dalit Dravidian movement in the South which did it. And in Maharashtra, don't forget, Maharashtra is a place where Jyotiba Phule and Ambedkar happened.
Absolutely.
So you have society driven by Jyotiba's ideas and Ambedkar's steps. There were people who took these big steps for us to follow and for everyone to follow. The other did not have such all-encompassing different leaders and stuff like that. That
We did
kind of
not.
movement.
Yeah.
We had a
Yeah.
sort of a left movement in Bengal, which started from 1920s, and therefore that whole revolutionary Swadeshi mix movement here, and in Punjab, the Bhagat Singh movement, all that kind of, the agrarian thing in Punjab, the UP, you had the industrial movement and all this stuff. So that kind of, I won't say hijack, but appropriated the what could have been caste uprising or whatever. That didn't happen there. So then Maharashtra and the South specifically, you have these two.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, you would have, there are a few writers, again, I'm thinking of back in the day, someone like, let's say, Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay, often called Bengalese Charles Dickens, the Charles Dickens of Bangla literature. But he's also writing from a particular position, isn't it? Yeah, and
it's more about women emancipation is part of it than the caste aspect. That's not played up, that's not.
It's not. And even when it is, I think, what you were talking about earlier, there's a very sort of patronizing attitude.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well-meaning, maybe. Well-meaning in that context, in the 1920s, 1930s, might have been well-meaning, might even have been revolutionary for some people. And he got a lot of flack for some of his writings. But when you look at it, when you read it in context now, as opposed to that, I think there's a lot more writing coming up now. Manohar Mouli Vishwash, Manoranjan Bapari, writing great stuff, getting translated a lot. So some of it is coming up at this point in time. If you read Motua literature, Motua philosophy, there is some of that over there. But I think we are getting more sort of, I don't want to use the word authentic, but for want of a better one, we're getting more lived experiences at this point in time. Yeah.
So I guess it's a spiritual strain also, which is like with the Motua culture and all that. It's a spiritual strain which, from the bhakti movement to this particular, there's a certain kind of, a cord which gets attached from the bhakti movement to the so-called depressed caste movement in Bengal, and there is a certain crossing of wires there. Somehow, the Chaitanya, this thing comes down here through the Baul movement, through all that, because you have a tribal participation in there, you have a depressed caste participation within that.
Yeah, since Mr. Shantanu was asking about mostly Bengali literature, I think we shouldn't miss Shweta Devi, because she has a lot to say, and without a patronizing attitude, actually, and she doesn't really stay limited to only a kind of a prismatic portrayal of just caste, but inter-caste kind of violence done to women. How can we forget Stannodaini and the Breast Stories, the entire trilogy? So that wonderful, what a wonderful introduction. I'm like extremely enlightened today by the three of you. And Joy, if you want to say a little more about theatre, and then I'll just move to Mr. Shantanu for the last question.
Theatre, we have had certain directors who specifically worked in certain communities. Those are theatre movements. Habib Tanvi specifically worked in the Chhattisgarh region with the Chhattisgarh tribes, and his theatre was primarily the expression of the Chhattisgarh tribes. He did plays like Jamadarin, which is not written by Habib Tanvi, it came from the Chhattisgarh space, where a Jamadarin takes on a Brahminical priest. So Habib Tanvi dedicated his entire life to the depressed caste, depressed class of people over there. And you have other such theatre directors who have worked specifically in certain region with certain people, like Ratan Thyam works with in the northeast with so-called tribal caste or class over there. So you have people in theatre who, because they're working in regions, because they're working with the undercaste, underclass, depressed people, and they're creating a movement which is as much theatre movement as a socio-theatre movement. They're taking on alcoholism here, they're taking on dowry there, whatever, but they're using the community to speak for the community, So in theatre, you have that reflection. But cinema being a capitalist machine of a product or a vehicle, because you need capital to make cinema, and therefore when capital is needed to make cinema, all the capitalist elements come in, and it dilutes. It has to dilute a lot of things. The dilution is always more in cinema than in theater, because in theater you can go to people, be with people, talk with them, talk to them, and listen to them. So that's theater. That's interactive within a region. The people who are working in, say, Sundarban. There's a whole Jan Sanskriti movement going on in Sundarban. It's been going on for the last 30 years. It's a brilliant movement where the Sundarban women talk about their issues here, there, and sometimes in festivals held in Brazil, all the way there, which is fantastic. But cinema doesn't have that indigenous movement. Where is an indigenous cinema movement? Where is the Dalit cinema movement? Documentary space, yes. Anand Padvarjan has made a lot of films on from Dalit perspective, yes. In the documentary space, yes. But in the cinema space, even in the independent cinema space, once in a while we talk about Manjule, because a Pandri comes and it hits us like a tight slap on our face. Way back, Govind Nilani made Akrosh, which was like it didn't let me sleep for a couple of nights. So once in a while you get this thing, but these are decades before these kind of impactful stuff comes to us. But in theater, there are lots and lots. Mahabharata has been used to create a lot of subversive subplots using Sharvalik is a character which is taken from Mahabharata, and Sharvalik has given rise to many plays, Sanskrit and non-Sanskrit plays, of this undercaste thief who rebels against the king. So, subplots of Mahabharata and Ramayana have been taken, and very progressive plays have been written by someone like Dudnath Singh from Allahabad University, who is a professor of literature there. He's written beautiful plays, mythological plays, where Indra is challenged by Purva, the tribal Dalit, whatever you call it. At that time, he didn't have the term Dalit leader, who refuses to chant the mantra of Indra when he is being coronated in the forest. He steals the Apsara from Indra's court, or the Apsara falls in love with him. So those are like sacrilege. The upper class Apsara from Indra's court falls in love with Purva, the underclass tribal maverick. So such plays have been written by people who are reimagining and looking at it, sort of turning mythologies upside down and bringing in the subaltern perspective into it, and etc. So that is happening in theater. But cinema, yes, you have an Adur sometimes touching things, and John Abraham in Kerala touching things here and there. But where do you have the impactful? So that's why we are discussing Matan, because that stayed with us once, but it's not a movement. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's lovely. And when you talk about how these all are happening in the middle of nature, and how there's surprisingly and funnily always a natural connotation, or the connotation of paganism and religion happening, kind of like looking at everything as an alibi, but not really taking part in the solution of it. So anyway, my last question for Mr. Shantanu today, and after that we'll take up questions from the audience. So Mr. Shantanu, I do not have to say it, but you are the encyclopedia of the entire cinematic universe, and you have written tons on it. And so I'll just ask for a very generic opinion of yours, and how do you think this concept of matrimony, or the position of a woman in a matrimonial setup, especially intercaste matrimonial setup, has kind of evolved through ages? If we see from the very primitive Satyajit Ray movies, or even older than those, and the very modern cinema, be it in the Hindi industry or the Bengali industry, or even Hollywood in a way. So what would you like to say about it?
It's a very broad question, like it covers a lot of, I don't think we have the bandwidth at this point of time to discuss the whole journey. As I mentioned, intercaste relationships, marriages haven't been part of the narrative. Not even somebody like Satyajit Ray has, apart from his Sadgati, I don't think there are very many films that even Ray has made that has addressed the issue of caste or relationships. Sadgati is, of course, his cruelest. It's been called his cruelest film, and that says something because that's where he addresses the issue of caste. The depiction of women and in matrimonial relationships, I think uh, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Sort of, like we had uh, in terms of the dynamic woman character we had even in the 1930s. We had somebody like Fearless Nadia, who was totally independent of the men in her. She didn't need a man around her. She was the person to be, to have around you if you wanted to feel protected. But somewhere down the line, uh, that thing changed. There were a few iconic woman characters in the 50s, like but then most of them, be it if you look at Mother India, you look at Mughal Azam, these are designated iconic women characters, but then they're all, in that uh, trope of the sufferer, the silent sufferer, sort of. There is very little progressiveness in the character, like she's just bearing the burden. There's no, and it carried on right through the cinema, the parallel cinema movement in India, sort of brought in certain developments in it. You had a Shabana Azmi play the character in Ankur, or you had Bhumika, sort of, which was it, or Mandi, so that kind of thing came, or Jabbar Patel's films with Smita Patil got some. But then mainstream cinema has pandered to, because the audience is largely male, with the producers have been, the makers have been largely male. How many you can actually count the number of women filmmakers, like films based on caste? The reason they haven't been made is because there haven't been makers like Neeraj or Nagraj, or Ranjit, who come from that position to. So there haven't been. And if there's a filmmaker like Farah Khan, she sort of panders to uber male sort of world. So that, and in the 90s, with the coming of economic liberalization and all of a sudden you had a huge impact on women coming into the workforce. But look at the cinema of that time, look at the popular cinema of that time, be it Dilwale Dulhania, be it Hum Aapke Hain Kaun. All of them are about women looking for their Prince Charming, coming riding in a horse and taking them away. None of them are actually part. So that's been the narrative. It's only in the last few years, you have had a Kangana playing, that I
Queen.
forget the
Queen. Queen.
Queen, of course, Queen. We've had films like that, but more or less, it's been traditional, very sort of women being portrayed in the way men want. I don't see women being portrayed in the way they would, their worldviews coming forward. It's something, I think it's a subject for another panel altogether. Like, so it's
Mm.
uh,
Women in cinema.
yeah. That's, I think, I don't know if that answers your question, or I've been truant like we have been all through this discussions.
So actually, I actually agree with like all of you, and I wish I couldn't have like named this session intercaste marriages, because we kind of talked about anything and everything in
Yeah.
any and every art. So it was wonderful interacting with all of you, and whatever I say actually stands short. And I'll take two questions. We have time, so yeah. Mr. Arun asks, "Is not mentioning in the name caste is not okay?" Wait. I'll just check. Okay, I think we have covered most of it. So, in intercaste marriages, do they come out of layers of difference or they are not studied? As Joy Sengupta talked about, Vijay Tendulkar plays. So, Joy, would you like to take
Uh,
this?
yeah, what's the question again?
Uh, in intercaste marriages, do they come out of layers of difference or they are not studied at all? Since we were talking about
Do
Vijay
they,
Tendulkar.
do they come out of layers of difference? Is that the question?
Yeah, yeah. Layers
What is
of differences or they are not studied.
study? What is it?
Yes.
I didn't get the core of the question.
Mr. Arun, would you like to modify a little bit and make it a little clearer? I'll go to the next question by that time. So, I see OTT is exploring various themes when compared to mainstream cinema. This is not a question. I saw a question involving Satyajit Ray. Yeah, so how do you understand Satyajit Ray movies? I think based on this discipline, we are talking about intercaste marriages. So, any of you,
Well,
please go on.
Ray or any other filmmaker, very few filmmakers, actually, you see, these issues were looked at as messages.
Yeah.
And films didn't go into these issues because they were like messages. कि हिंदू मुस्लिम भाई भाई, the message. You know, हमें जात पात को अपने समाज से उच्छेद करना है, like a poster message. So you'll have a street play on that. Lot of street plays have been done on that. But cinema, no. Cinema in our country moved from escapism to aspiration. You had escapism before economic liberalization. Post economic liberalization, it was aspiration. So even a Dalit or even a lower class has aspirations of being something. And those aspirations are projected as Shahrukh and whatever character. Quasi-NRI character, diaspora character, frolicking in Australia or Los Angeles or wherever, aspirations to be like that. Whether you become like that or not. So cinema has been like that. And the escapist movies which you had earlier of a hero jumping from a 12-story building and beating up 12 guys and rescuing one damsel in distress who then falls in love with him, and then after a little bit of turbulence, they come together. That's escapism. And aspiration is this, this clothes, this gadget, this false modernism, this getting out of this filthy country called India into other shores and frolicking there because the frame looks so beautiful there. The sea looks like sea there, and the sand looks like sand, and the mountains look like mountains, so we shoot there. And create and keep pandering the aspirations of all castes and all classes. So that's why in cinema, we won't have that. And if you really look at OTT now, we are going the same way. We are only feeding them crime stories. Because crime stories dilutes all nuancing. You don't need nuancing. You just need a plot. And okay, so you have a Delhi crime story, which takes the Nirbhaya thing. It puts a woman right in the center. It's the woman who is investigating. It's the woman who has been raped. So what the woman feels, the men don't feel. The men police officers don't feel. That nuancing is there in Delhi crime. That's why Delhi crime is interesting. But we are moving away from all of that. Indian OTT is going I hope it doesn't, but going the television way. So like in television, post-liberalization, where women were coming out, working, taking over multinational companies and other companies, in Indian television serials, women were confined to their homes, in joint families, wearing heavy jewelry, heavy sarees, and doing nothing. Nobody does nothing, but they're all moneyed and they all bicker about the man. They're going to go similar step is way in OTT also. I hope I'm proving wrong.
Two of you would like to speak about it, Somrita and Mr. Shantanu?
Yeah, you see, I think the problem with cinema has been that, particularly with Hindi cinema, is that it has to be national in character. So it has to sort of downplay differences, or paper over differences. OTT, I would have thought, would offer a different perspective that's not coming across, because I think at the end of the day, those who made films are going on to OTTs. Though in the last 2-3 months, I've come across a couple of very interesting films that addressed caste very directly in that, and diametrically opposite. Like one was Halla Ho Do So Halla Ho, which is about this whole group of Dalit women chopping a sort of molester down in the courtroom. So very well made. Again, it had its problems. The central protagonist woman has to have a Brahmin uh, boyfriend, who is very paternalistic. मुझे मदद करनी है, that kind of thing. Though the central character, the character played by Amol Palekar, does not believe in that. And he sort of keeps on saying, "Don't put me on the inquiry commission, just because I am Dalit." So that is there. That's an interesting thing, and I don't think. I think that film got released primarily because it was on OTT. Chauda Fere is a different sort of thing. Again, addresses caste issues and addresses it in a fun manner. It's in a sort of playful sort of way. Comes across some of the things hit, some of the uh, uh, points they're making hit home. A lot doesn't. So it's sort of. But then the thing with caste is like the thing with war. The history of war is made by the victor. It's the winner who writes the history. With caste, it's been like, and particularly in cinema, it's the dominant caste which writes the film, and the people from the lower caste haven't actually made films. So which sort of, so the attitude has been that. I hope that addresses part
Yeah.
of the.
No, my take on this might sound controversial, is that our conversation, as far as caste is concerned, whether that's in cinema or in literature, has been of a very tokenist nature, even in our academia, right? We are doing token lip service. That's what we're doing. There is not enough in depth conversation because of what I said right at the beginning. Who are the people that have the capital to even engage in these conversations? है ना? So abhi we are hearing a little bit from, let's say, Manoranjan Lepari. Abhi we are hearing a little bit from Manohar Moli Bishash. What was happening before that? This is an example that Manoranjan Lepari brings up very often in his conversations, and I completely agree with what he says. Manik Bandyopadhyay, one of the best, most nuanced writers we've had in Bangla literature. But he says, even Manik Bandyopadhyay uses a phrase like chor chamar, churi chamari. What does stealing have to do anything with a person's occupation? But it is that ingrained in the language. So he says, you want to know about caste? I'm not saying don't read Manik Bandyopadhyay. I'm not saying don't watch Satyajit Ray. I'm saying also listen to what I have to say. It's the same as, women wanting to tell their own stories now, instead of men writing them, because they've done a very bad job of it. Most men, sometimes they describe curves and cunts and tits in a way, and I wonder, have you ever seen a woman like, the one you've imagined wouldn't be able to stand straight? I mean, it's gravity defying. But it's a lot like that. And the other thing that I've noticed, especially in the academia, is that trends aate jate rehte hain. So at one point in time, it was very fashionable to talk about class, irrespective of what your class background was. Everybody was a socialist. Currently, I think it's very fashionable to talk about women and gender issues and emancipation. Caste, unfortunately, has not had its moment, is my personal opinion, yet. We are far from there. And I think Joy and Shantanu, both of them, I mean, they hit they were able to recognize the problem. The problem is capital. To publish, you need money. To make a film, you need money. Street theater kar lenge. Street play kar lenge. Theater, you're able to reach out to a lot more people. But when it comes to capital, who is holding this capital? Who is going to publish your work? We talk a lot about Dalit literature, for example. Look at a press like Panther's Paw. It's run by a colleague, Yogesh Maitri. Yeah, he has to borrow money. He's crowdfunding books. Where is the capital? Your narratives will always come from the person that holds the capital. So, unless that can be changed, unless we we shift our attitude from this sort of lip service to an actual introspection, actual engagement, it's going to be a bit of a problem having more narratives out.
Yeah, I think the very question of narratives become very important here. We don't really get a proper primary direct narrative from a Dalit person to make something of an art on him. So, okay, I'll close this session with our last question today, also from Mr. Arun, who says that after they're into a marriage, I'm guessing inter-caste, they face differences which are in multiple layers and say culture difference, gender. So while making movies or theatre, are these portrayed effectively, especially in Vijay Tendulkar's play? Joy, would you like to take on this?
I would say yes. It all depends broadly on what his focus is. Every theme has a focus. So when he's making a play like Ghasiram Kotwal, the focus was the rebellion against the Peshwas and the Brahmins. So it comes across. When he's making a play like Kanyadan, it is more about interpersonal relationship, which in a way becomes a representation of the caste conflict. So we are seeing the man-woman dynamic there. We are seeing love and we are seeing violence. We are seeing all that probably is there in a man-woman relationship in different classes of society. But only difference is here, the caste equation also comes in. And there is disturbing questions about Gandhism versus Ambedkarism. For me, Kanyadan represented that. Because here was a Gandhian socialist and here was in Mahan. So basically Ambedkarite. So that dichotomy between Gandhi and Ambedkar is the same one. The pacifist Gandhian sort of a tokenism or whatever you call it side, and the Ambedkarite movement which went into the militant movement later on. So that was the conflict which came. So but in theatre, a good drama will always try to bring the drama out. It's not a good drama will never focus on just the agenda. It will be the drama will come out, the human drama has to come out, and there is no agenda. The nuancing will happen through the drama. So whatever the play. So yeah, I think Tendulkar is broad enough to be able to attempt from all sides. He has written one fabulous play called Jati Pucho Sadhu Ki, which is a play also on casteism in a way. Like Sadhu ki bhi jaat पूछते हैं क्या? Do we ask the caste of a sadhu, or a jnani, or whatever you call it? Jati Pucho Sadhu. It was a very rebellious play. So Tendulkar is actually is one of those ones who has really gone into this. He's not a Dalit playwright, but he has, when he's writing about society, agrarian society, Maharashtrian, Western Maharashtra, Vidarbhan agrarian society, or Konkanastha Maharashtrian society. When he writes a play which is on the Konkanastha Brahman culture comes out. Konkanastha Brahman prejudices come out. So it's not that he's whitewashing anybody. No. The Konkanastha Brahman prejudices are portrayed properly, fully. He's never whitewashing. That's Tendulkar's greatness, that he's always asking questions and disturbing wonders that.
Yes, I completely agree, because in my discipline as well, I'm a student of literature, and I read Tendulkar. It's always extremely politically bold, and I can't really stop questioning throughout the text. Okay, so I'll wind up tonight. A huge kind of like round of applause for all the three of you. Wonderful session, wonderful discussions, wonderful insights. So, and thank you so much for joining us today on TMYS. And this is to all the audience. Please contribute to our December session, and for more information, join www.tellmeyourstory.biz. So good night. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much.
Honored, privileged, Joy and Somrita. We'll hope to be in touch with you.
Bilkul, it's been such